Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for checking out my channel, and welcome back. So today is going to be the second lesson in my Creating Your Protagonist series. Began last week by kind of going over the basic foundations. And just to recap, what this series is about is developing your character first if you are thinking about writing a story. So before you go through the stages of plotting, laying down the plot and laying down the outline of your tale, this here is to help develop your character first. Last week's video, I went over kind of the reasons why I advocate for starting with understanding and creating your character and their motivations before plotting and outlining. And so this right here is going to be the continuation. So if you're following along in order, last week we went over the foundations and I covered the ideas of someone's subconscious and surface level desires. Now we're getting into the weeds here. This is when we start getting into kind of the hands-on aspect. So I hope you all have your word processor open or have a pen and paper handy because you're going to be doing some exercises here. All right. So this right here is the first core lessons. These are going to be the first core lessons of the series. And today it's all about developing the basic plot and theme for your character. And so you might be thinking like plot and theme, what does that have to do with character, right? Are we focusing on character motivations? Yes, but now we're going to start building the foundations of the story around your protagonist. Some of these exercises here in this first week you may have already done. If you have a story already either in the works or in your head, or you have kind of an idea of what you want to work on, some of these lessons will probably be pretty easy to do, which is good. Basically give you a good setup for the next week, which where we start getting into a lot more of the character specific motivations. But for now, this week basically is about kind of the foundations of the story. So let's dive into it. So when starting out, this is at the very beginning of you conceptualizing your story. You have maybe a general idea of what you want your story to be about. This is where we start refining it and start basing it around a character. So we begin with what I call part one, which is the point or the idea. What do you want to write about? Okay. What ideas do you want to discuss in your novel? And so I'm going to go over some examples here, and throughout the entire series, I'll be going over examples from my current novel that I'm working on right now, so you can get an idea of what you have to do for these lessons. All right, and when it comes to ideas, they can be general or they can be vague. This is a very sort of ethereal idea, like if there's just some aspect of a story you want to work on or some aspect of writing that you want to explore, that's basically what the stage is all about. And so it can be a general theme or idea that you've seen before in, say, movies or books. And I'm going to give an example right here from my current story. So what you do for this first lesson is just come up with that. So go through and kind of refine maybe what you want to work on or what you want your story to be about. And again, theme or general idea is really what you're aiming for. And so here are some examples from my story that I'm working on. The general theme I wanted to work on was the idea of people losing themselves in pursuit of a goal, and in the end, that rendering the goal meaningless, right? The idea of a hollow victory. Okay. Again, that one right there is maybe a bit more refined and specific because I've gone through this so many times. At first, you might just have some general ideas or some general themes you want to express in your story. So understandably, yours may not be as refined maybe as this one, or maybe not be as specific. As you go through these lessons, I want you to go back to it and refine, make several drafts, make several revisions of what you want to do and what you want to explore, because oftentimes what you're going to write down first is not going to be that. You're going to write down, one-word responses probably when you first do this. But as you go through this exercise and as you kind of explore what you want your theme or the idea of your story to be about, try and refine it to what I did, where it's a bit more specific. Again, it'll be vague at first, but the more specific you can get, the better. Okay? And so this is my example just for what I wanted to do with my story. That's kind of where the story really began for me. So as you do that, as you go through, just try to get maybe a single sentence, if you can, about what the general theme and idea you want your story to be about. All right. On to part 2. So once you've done that, we get more into what I call the general idea. And I know these titles are somewhat vague. I've not found a way to make these more compartmentalized. I haven't found a way basically to really categorize these as specifically. Maybe someone else can do it. When I go through this process, it's pretty fluid, and so I use kind of these fluid terms for it, which I call. So this one I'm just calling the general idea. But what it is what are your areas of interest? And so we're going to explore now how you want to apply the theme. In what context do you want this theme to take place? Is there maybe a general story that comes to mind? Often, I think when people come up with stories, I've mentioned before, I think in the last video, you might just come up with a scene in your head, right? The first idea of a story might just be a scene that comes to your mind. What is that? What is that general scene? What is that story that's popping into your head? And if there is a scene that you can picture, what is it about? What does it entail? And so I'm going to go through here in a second, go through mine, but these again are going to be general areas and tropes that you can explore. So I'm not looking for so much the specific scene, but more of the tropes that you want your tale to be about. We're basically taking part 1 and we're going a bit more detailed. So I mentioned in part 1 the idea of a hollow victory, but now how do I want to explore it? What setting do I want to put that in? What areas do I want to explore that within the context of? Okay. So I'm going to give some examples right now of what I did. So for my story, I wanted to explore the idea of small town struggles. So yes, we're going to look at the idea of a hollow victory, but with maybe the concept within the context of a small town, right? So idea of maybe poverty, drugs, loss of industry playing a role. I like the idea too of rivalry and competition based on a personal grudge, right? Something you might have seen in the film The Prestige, if you've seen that. And a lot of these examples, you can go back to films and other mediums that you've seen this sort of ideas explored before, and basically use those as kind of a premise for maybe what you want to explore. So I mentioned rivalry and competition. I think it's always been very exciting, and I want to tell a story about that, a story of deep-seated rivalry. And I also want to tell a story about obsessive pursuit, something you might have seen in the films like Whiplash or The Novice, stories where people lose themselves, right? So if you go back to part 1, where I discussed the idea of the hollow victory, the idea of losing yourself in the pursuit, and the goal becomes maybe less meaningful or perhaps meaningless because you lose yourself in pursuit of that, I wanted to do a story that's along those similar concepts. So the novel I'm looking to write is going to include these 3 ideas in some fashion, in some context. It's going to include these 3 tropes there. Okay, so for yourself, just go through and do the same thing. Start listing them down, and again, it can be more than 3. I mean, when I've kept mine pretty relatively small, but for you, if you might be 12, it might be a dozen, 2 dozen, whatever it might be, but just try to throw out some ideas. As you refine, you'll want to nail it down to a handful, because to do a novel where you're exploring 12 different areas of interest is very, very difficult. It's very, very challenging to do that. So you do want to start narrowing the field down to maybe like 3, like I have here, just because it's a bit easier to tell a story around these ideas than it is if you have a ton. But in the beginning, throw it all down. And as you revise, as you go through these lessons, start paring it down. Start kind of getting rid of the things that you don't necessarily want to do. All right. Now we're on to part 3, refining the idea. This is where we start going from more of the general ideas, the general tropes, and start refining it to something that we can apply to a character. Okay. So I want you to see if you can combine parts 1 and 2 of these lessons and make a general lesson or idea that you want your character to experience. Is there maybe a moral that you want them to learn from this? Is there some sort of experience you want them to go through? And these are probably going to be cliches, and that's absolutely fine. If you do an example of me here in a second, I'm going to offer 2. My story has 2 protagonists. I'm going to offer 2. And again, I hope when you see the examples, it'll make more sense what I'm talking about. Again, when it comes to doing this, it's not, again, it's a bit more fluid. It's not something that's so categorical that you can I think I can compartmentalize it into this very straightforward thing. So if you are maybe having a hard time following along what I'm going over here, leave it in the comments that I can get back to you on this. This is like my halfway point of like, hey, put some in the comments, comment in the video if you like it, if you have any kind of questions, because understandably coming up with characters and creating them, it's not really done in like a very straightforward beat by beat manner. This is more general. This is me doing my best to make it that way, but it doesn't always work that way. So as this is being presented here, I understand this is being maybe a little bit confusing. I hope the examples maybe help here. And so what I'm talking about when I'm saying apply a lesson or idea is taking what you did in the first couple sections and applying it to a character. So like I said, I have two protagonists in my story. So protagonist A, or protagonist 1, I decided to take the idea of the hollow victory, of the small town struggles, of the obsessive pursuit and the rivalry and all that stuff. And this is the general lesson that I have for the character. Okay. The general idea theme for the character is a dream is not worth pursuing if you lose yourself in the pursuit of it. I've talked about this in the past couple examples here. Now it's more solidified. This is specifically what I want the character to experience. And now, for the other protagonist of the story, there are some dreams that are worth losing everything over. They're basically the inverses of each other. The two characters are inverses of each other, which is actually where you get the tension, and in many ways in the story, you get that sort of that sense of competition in the rivalry in the plot. Because these characters are going through two different experiences, experiencing basically the same story, and I'm doing my best not to give away too much here because it hasn't come out yet, but I want you to see that I've used it before. Because you actually create your own sense of tension. A very natural tension develops when you have two characters that either have competing worldviews or competing objectives. There's a natural tension that develops, and you have these two characters here where there's going to be just natural tension because they are going through an opposite phase. You have, in essence, a character that's going to be going through something and going to be losing themselves in the pursuit of it, and you have the second character which is going to be going through something and learning that maybe, yes, that this dream is worth losing things over. And so that creates a very natural sense of tension there. This is more of an aside, but if you are creating it, but I want you to see how this ties into plot as well. So for you, I want you to take your protagonist, and hopefully you have just one. I know that multiple protagonists, obviously you got to do these for every single one of them, but this becomes much easier when you have just one protagonist. And this is kind of like, one of your earlier stories if you're watching this because maybe you're trying to write your book for the first time, or this is one of the first few novels that you've worked on, and maybe it's the first time you think maybe you can write a successful one. Starting smaller always works, and that one protagonist makes it much easier of a process. But that is what I have. So you take parts 1 and 2, and you crumb up basically with a sort of general character lesson you want to be developed here, or an idea you want your character to experience. This is what it would be. And this is the last part of the lesson for today. If you've done parts 1, 2, and 3 successfully, you're already looking good. I imagine you probably have a better story already, or potential for a better story than you would have if you did not start with a character first. Because now you're starting to have a waypoint for your character. You have a sort of metaphorical North Star for your character. If you're writing a story about a character basically pursuing a dream and losing in the pursuit of it, that's already something you can plot out. That's already a sort of a trope that we've seen before that can be plotted out relatively successfully here. Just kind of if you do a write by number style. Obviously you want to be a bit more refined with what you do, but even if it was just write by number style, that can be done. Okay, so now we're on to the last part here, which is developing a basic plot synopsis. This is where we start getting even more refined. This is where we actually come up with a plot or an idea. And this will take you the longest amount of time, probably. So, take part 3, so what we just did here, and try and come up with a basic plot synopsis for your character. So, we talked about the idea of the character and the lesson we want. We've talked about the tropes in part 2, small town struggles in my example, obsessiveness and all that stuff. Can you now come up with a plot? Can you come up with a story that takes place in a certain setting with some sort of general plot? Can you make a story out of that? This is what we're looking to do. And this plot synopsis can be a few sentences, really. And so this is where that what if scenario I've talked about comes in. If you do the person that does the what if scenario, now is the time to implement it. Now that you have a basic character and a lesson you want the character to go through, now we have the what if. The theme has been established. Now the what if can come in. As an example for myself, okay, this is where it transforms. You're going to see a jump here in a second from like generally what I wanted the characters to experience to the actual story. So here it is. Here's like my elevator pitch in a sense, and that's what you should work on. What if 2 small town wrestlers were given a chance to compete for a national contract, facing a chance to perform at a world-class level and leave their struggling town behind? Both competitors scheme against one another for a chance to be scouted. There it is, right there. 2 sentences. 2-sentence elevator pitch, and yet we've taken part 3 and we've actually made it something tangible. It's no longer this general story, but now we actually have an actual plot here, something that can actually be developed. And so next week, we're going to go more into developing more of the character motivations, but this is what you're going to need now to move forward with the character motivations and also to start maybe outlining your story. Now that we have something, you can now start building an outline around that. All right. And so, again, for yourself, go through and do the same thing. This is where kind of the fun also comes in a sense, because now you're taking the general ideas and the concepts that were pretty, again, generalized, and now you're putting it to action. Now you're actually seeing these things put into something that can be made into a story. And so go through and do it. Again, these lessons, even though I'm going through it pretty quick, these lessons take time. They take a lot of revision. It takes a lot of time going through this. When I went through this process for my story, it took me at least probably a week of going through these lessons to every single night for a week after work to pare this down and to come up with something that's maybe tangible that I could do. So take your time with it. Don't feel like you have to rush through these lessons. The more that you refine this, the better you're going to be later on. And that's what the real crux of this is about, is doing all of the work at the beginning and saving yourself all of the headaches at the very end. The more refined your character understanding is, the more refined your outline is. The more refined that your outline is, the more refined your drafts of your story are going to be. The less structural edits that you'll have to do, the less of a headache you'll have. Ideally, life happens, things happen through the process. It's never smooth, but ideally that's what we want to get to. Okay. And so this is going to be just a quick recap. Again, starting with all 4 stages, 4 parts, 4 lessons, whatever you want to call it. Begin with the point or the idea, the theme. From there, develop the general story ideas and tropes that you want to involve. Then apply the tropes and ideas and the general theme to maybe a character lesson, something that you want your characters to experience and go through. Finally, develop that into a basic synopsis, a basic plot synopsis of about, a paragraph. We'll say a paragraph of what you want your story to be about. If you can do that, that's awesome. You are done with this week's lesson. Move on to next week's lesson, and we'll basically continue to refine this. The next week is where we're going to get a little bit more in detail when it comes to specific motivations to help build the plot. Right here, we didn't get into that. This week, there was not really any discussion of motivations, because first we have to come up with the character, the theme, and what we want them to experience. After this, we can start doing the motivations. Now that you have a character, just give my example, now we have characters where we want to explore the idea of losing themselves in pursuit of a dream, and also characters that experience the idea of going after a dream that's maybe worth losing themselves for, now we can start getting into motivations. Why do they experience this? So if this is what you want to show, okay, so what's the character's reasons for doing what they're doing, and why are they doing it? What are their motivations, their subconscious motivations? We can start getting into that more now that we've established this, which is what next week's lesson is going to be about. But for this week, go through these lessons, refine them. I would say if you're doing this live, like in the sense of when I'm uploading this in real time, take this week. Video goes up next week. Watch next week's video, and then after 1 week of doing these lessons, and you'll be in a good position for next week and to basically go forward with the series. My goal at the end of this, I've said before, is to help you have established characters and established character motivations to build a plot around. That has been the goal of this entire 4-week, 4-lesson series. And so if you can follow along with this, I think you'll have tons of success. I know I've gone through, again, several stories where I've had to deal with this problem. And my goal is to try and help you avoid a lot of the mistakes that I made very early on. And so with that, I hope you've enjoyed this week's lessons. Again, it's very fluid. These concepts are somewhat vague at times because it's not the easiest thing in the world to compartmentalize. So if you have any kind of questions about what I put on here, leave it in the comments and I can get back to you and go over that more. All right. So I will see you all next week. Until then, be safe.